I'm joining us now to talk more about this is political analyst Michael Yaki.
Now, Michael, you also served on the Civil Rights Commission for 17 years, which dealt a lot with this issue on affirmative action.
Yes.
Good morning.
So your initial thoughts, given the makeup of the court, is it surprising to you that it came down this way?
It's not surprising at all. The last Supreme Court decision in 2016, which dealt with the university process in Texas and which upheld the fact that race could be a factor in admissions. Remember, you can't have quotas. This isn't about quotas. This is whether or not you can say that race can be an enhancing factor in whether or not someone gets admitted to a college or to a university or not. And in 2016, the court said yes. Only Justice Sotomayor is left from that court. That's how much turnover has occurred in that time. And you know, if you ever want to have the old maxim that elections matter, this is where elections matter, because you see that this new majority, three of whom were appointed by former President Trump, joined together to do this. And now, back to my role on the commission. For 17 years, I served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And in every single one of those 17 years, this was an issue that the conservatives sought to try and bring up and have the commission create some kind of precedent on. And I was always fighting against it for that entire period of time, because I saw the experience of what happened in California when we outlawed, by Proposition, I think, 209, outlawed affirmative action in the public schools here. You saw the drop by almost 50% of African Americans and Hispanics, Latino students in California, to the point where the representation of, for example, Latino students for the next generation that is coming into ready to go into college this year, only about half of them have the opportunity to even be considered for the UC system. The rest are completely knocked out. So this is something that we've seen in real world consequences in California, and now the rest of the country is going to be able to deal with that as well.
Michael, you brought up some excellent points there. You talked about how we had that here in California. Do you think that students are going to now be discouraged, minority students specifically, from applying to some of these private institutions now that affirmative action has been struck down?
Well, it's going to be interesting, because you're going to see the UC has tried different things. They've tried socioeconomic status. They're looking at zip code, where historically underrepresented zip codes in the university. But race is the easiest and best. You can't use these proxies perfectly. And the fact is that race has always been, I think, an important factor in American education. This goes back to Brown versus Board. This goes back to the idea of why we desegregated our schools, because Justice Earl Warren, who was from California at that time, said that in this very famous footnote 4 that says, by in and of itself, the ability of people to essentially be in an environment with other races in and of itself is a socioeconomic good. And what's really interesting is that is still lingering. And I think part of the hypocrisy, of this decision is that Justice Roberts exempted the military academies. And why is that? Well, because our military right now is disproportionately minority. So he felt it was important that the military be able to have officers who could essentially relate to the people that they would be commanding. So the military academies are all exempt from this. You can have affirmative action at the Air Force Academy, at West Point, at the Naval Academy, because of the fact that it is important to how they function. Well, you can take that same ruling, that same exemption, and just really broaden it to everyone here. We have an increasingly diversified workforce. We have more people of all different races and ethnicities and nationalities coming into America is becoming increasingly more diverse. And yet what this ruling will do is essentially make universities more white, and I'm going to say this, more Asian as well, to the detriment of anyone else of other colors, of other races, other nationalities, who should have an opportunity to participate, I believe, at these elite universities. Because look, there's no right to go to Harvard, right? There's no right to go to to Yale. There is, however, the opportunity to go, and opportunity has always been even more as important as race in terms of how we decide what we are as a country. And this is a real setback for how we try and work together, especially at the time when race is becoming increasingly more and more a flashpoint in how we relate to each other in this country.
Yeah, more and more divided as opposed to diverse. You know, you talked about over the years about how there's always been this constant push to, remove these affirmative action protections from, higher education, and that the argument that's always been proffered is that we want to achieve race neutrality, right? If you want us to be in a colorblind society, we have to remove this. But it brings to mind those social experiments. There have been a ton of them where you'll have identical resumes, let's say, one that has a traditionally white-sounding candidate and one that has a minority-sounding candidate name at the top. And in more cases than not, that white-sounding name will often get a callback for an interview and the minority name won't, even though the applications are identical. So for those who say college admissions should be based purely on merit, purely on the application sitting before the admissions office, how do we prevent that sort of under the cover sort of bias to creep in and get these callbacks to everybody who's qualified, as opposed to this sort of like, picking and choosing based on personal biases?
Well, you raise an important question and issue, James. I mean, implicit bias is something that it exists. It is there. You can go online and take a test and see, unfortunately, how you turn out on that. But the fact is that all of this is connected. Is connected to the fact that we have had a historically segregated society. We have done, through the Supreme Court beginning in 1954 and continuing on since then, has tried to say that we should do what we can to make it less segregated. We should have a place where, but you have this constant pushback by others who believe race neutrality, race neutrality, race neutrality, and what does that really mean? It means that, well, I want to make sure that I get mine. Essentially, that's what it boils down to. When these folks who brought the lawsuit, and I understand they're frustrated that little Timmy or Jimmy or Tammy didn't get into Yale, or didn't get into Harvard, or didn't get into UNC. But the fact is, as I said, there's really no right to any of that. The question is, what do we think of as a society? How are we supposed to operate if we don't see people who we're going to be dealing with for the rest of our lives, if we don't understand, where they come from, what their background was, what their life experience was all about. And we're increasingly siloed as a society away from that. And the more that we continue to do that, the more you see that we still have the issues. I mean, not just the issue you raised, James, but remember, there are studies that show that if you have a real estate agent who's white versus one who's black, the one who's white is going to get picked way more than the black one, and to the point where they're taking a lot of African American, black and Latino real estate agents aren't putting their faces on their flyers anymore, or making their name. We're at a real inflection point for race in this country, and what the Supreme Court did today is throw it completely in a direction that I think is going to make this country less diverse, less tolerant, and less able to understand and see the challenges that a lot of minorities have in this country today.
Well, certainly lots to discuss and digest over this. Michael, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And
thank you, James. Thank you.
Plenty more to talk about.
Weighing in on a very nuanced topic there, so thank you for that. All right.
We're going to take a break. We'll be right back.